we still haven't found like a proper way of doing this, right? Last time I just shared my screen and we went through like the pages and just commented on them. Perhaps that already gave it a bit more structure, but I'm not sure if we should do that, if you guys thought that worked, or if we should just, I don't know, go over the themes and stuff from the chapter. I kind of have a summary here we can use if you guys want, just with the stuff that we already covered as well.
I think it would, since it's been a while since the last meeting, maybe we should review up until this point a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. I did this thing here that might help, like just, you know, like bullet points on the stuff from the previous chapter, just so it's easier to talk about them, you know? Just open my book here. Yeah, anyway, I think it would be good to just cover stuff, and perhaps we can kind of see if there are also important stuff that we skipped over that we wanted to return to. Like I just wrote down here the stuff that I remembered that we either discussed or that I thought was important about the first chapter, the one that's what is organizational science. You know, it starts with that whole thing about that the struggle of mankind is an organizational struggle, and it actually introduces very early on something that is in another of his books, and I think that it doesn't appear, like it appears in a different way here, but it doesn't appear elsewhere in the text. I think that it's like he's not gonna cover it afterwards, which is in one of his previous works, he gave this definition of nature, which is a kind of it's not really a functional definition, but it's kind of a dysfunctional definition. He says that nature is that which resists labor. So the positive term is actually labor, and the negative term is nature, right? And that's actually how he introduces the idea of nature here. He says that in the struggle of mankind with its elements, its aim is dominion over nature. But then he defines dominion as a relationship of the organizer to the organized. And then he says, nature resists elementally and blindly with a terrible strength of its dark, chaotic, but innumerable and infinite army of elements. So I think it's either another version of the Tektology book, or it's in a previous work that he introduces this idea, okay, but what I mean by dominion over nature. And he defines nature in this kind of negative sense, which I think there's something interesting to it. And I think that after this, he makes like a long kind of, not really long, but like a summary of these different kind of tools that we developed to organize something, right? To organize nature. And he goes through these. He first says that nature. He actually returns to this later on, right? He says that we both mimic nature in the ways that we organize nature. So in a way, there's a bit of a reduplication, and ultimately, there's nothing we can do which we could say that nature cannot do, right? Ultimately, I think he says at the beginning of chapter 3, the one that we said we would read for today, that ultimately all forms of organization are, he says in the first page of chapter 3, human methods cannot transcend the methods of nature and represent in relation to them special cases only, right? And so there is this kind of, the first kind of tool for organizing is pretty much being organized by nature. So the first structuring principle would be just, let's say, the very continuity between ourselves and the rest of the world, insofar as the rest of the world is, as he says, this big kind of army of forms of organization. You are also organized. For example, I guess he means things like the fact physiologically you're already kind of born with some structure. Then he goes through these three different types of more complex instruments for organization, right? The word, then ideas, and then social norms, right? Though it's not very clear if, I think there is a kind of step structure, right? Where the word would be the means for conscious collaboration of people, call to labor in the form of a request. But at the same time, it's something that he always says, right? You develop a form of organization, for example, the word, but it's also something that can be fetishized. Every new form can also become like a improperly generalized. I think he says this in page 2, in fact. For example, the organizing force of the word was made into a fetish and generalized over the entire universe. Then he says, okay, the idea is a second instrument of organization that is finer and more complex, which is something like an organizational scheme. Then he gives examples like a technical idea coordinates the efforts of people in a direct and manifest fashion. Scientific idea is an instrument of higher order, does the same thing, but more indirectly and on a larger scale. Artistic ideas serve as leading means of rallying the collective towards a unity of perception, feeling, and mood. And then there is a third kind of instrument, which is social norms. And he includes here customs, laws, morals, and decorum, which regulate relations amongst people in a collective and therefore strengthens their connections. So there is this kind of step-by-step, right, kind of complexification of forms of organization, and then he introduces kind of two poles. Like you begin with nature as a sort of background, then he starts talking about things that allow for better and more complex organization, words, commands, ideas, social norms, and so on. And then he kind of adds these two extremes or one position and something that's slightly different from that. He says, where does mankind obtain such instruments as speech, ideas, and norms? And he says it obtains from its experience, because all of them are products of organized experience. And I think that this is important because he's not suggesting, I think, that simply there is a continuum between experience in general and the development of instruments of organization, but that there is a process that leads from experience to organized experience, right? To be the product of organized experience. And that's when he introduces this idea that, well, therefore, organization is the sort of backbone. All problems can ultimately be transformed back to problems of organization. Mankind has no other activity except organizational activity. There being no other problems except organizational problems, right? Then he introduces this thing here, which is a kind of, I find this very, very specific to the Soviet situation. He says that, where is it? The deepest distinction which is known to exist is that between spontaneously blind action of nature and consciously planned efforts of people. But I'm not sure if this is a rhetorical example, because he says this is the greatest distinction, the deepest distinction, which is very much the distinction. Like if you open Lenin's What's to be Done, you see that that's how they would, everyone was talking in these terms, right? Spontaneous action of the masses versus organization, political organization. And, it's the whole debate with Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, a bunch of guys. So it's interesting that the early 20th century begins with this kind of dualism of spontaneity and organization, how these things kind of match or how they are different. And in this passage here, which is still in chapter 1, I like that he says this is the deepest distinction, So we should expect the greatest heterogeneity of methods and the greatest lack of unity, right? But then he says, well, but when you look at the difference between spontaneous natural development and planned conscious action, even though that's supposedly the greatest divide, you actually find two things. He calls it imitation and parallelism, right? Imitation in the sense that we're able to actually get inspired by natural structures and imitate them in social structures, so sort of mimetic process, and that also you get like parallelism between these processes where the natural development of something we could never have known, actually through a completely independent evolution, you find that things kind of repeat, right? So there where you're supposedly that there would be total random development, you actually find the establishment of similar structures, right? So it's interesting that now that I think of it, he's not really taking the side in the classic Soviet debate about spontaneity versus organization. He's not taking really a clear stance, right? He's saying, well, that's supposed. He makes two claims about, let's say, foundational divides in this book. The first one is this one: the greatest distinction is between spontaneity and organization. And then he kind of relativizes that, right, by saying that, well, but if you look at the two poles, they're actually mimicking each other, or there is organized structure in the spontaneous pole. It's not really that distinct. And I think the second kind of foundational distinction that he makes, which is also not symmetric, is when he says that there is no such thing as totally disorganized being. That disorganized being is the same as non-being, right? That pure structuralist being is not is a meaningless term. I think he says this somewhere, I forget where. So it's interesting. He says there is a difference between organized and disorganized, with the little caveat that one of the two poles doesn't exist. So it's again not a symmetric idea. Yeah, I just wanted to find that, but I don't know where he said.
Yeah, I think interesting question here is, what is, if not complete disorganization, what is a concept of partial disorganization in
in my copy is sorry Dennis, just I think I locate the quote. It's page 32 of the PDF if you have the same as mine. Page 5. Complete disorganization is a concept without meaning. It is in reality the same as naked non-being. For complete disorganization, it is necessary to assume a complete absence of connections. But that which has no connections cannot present any resistance to our efforts, and only in resistances do we learn about the existence of things. Consequently, for us, there is no such thing as complete disorganization. And to think about absolute disconnectedness is possible only verbally. It is not possible to put into such words any real living representation, because an absolutely incoherent representation is not representation at all. Generally, it is nothing. Sorry, just because I found here
but I see it's really good to see that there is a connection between resistance and existence, right? Things that exist resist in some sense, right? And resistance and being structured are connected. So if you are totally disorganized, you don't resist in any way. I think you can understand this as sort of a structure that imprints itself on another in some sense, kind of constrains the other to in some level, right? And if this leaves no mark, then there is it simply is indistinguishable from the. But the question you asked then is, I think, is actually answered in the chapter that we're reading now, because he gives a bit of a concept of partial disorganization, right? When he talks about where is it? Disjunction, and the cases where you can have a conjunction which partially adds to things and partially disorganizes them, right? and things like this. So
yeah. I think when he talks about linkage.
yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's later. Okay.
Yeah, I think that he covers, let's say, I mean, this is kind of a general tendency with him, right? I mean, he gives prevalence to the unifying pole over the separating one, right? He says conjunction has prevalence over disjunction. What he calls a conjunctive crisis has precedence over disjunctive crises. And I love that his examples are not like hippie holistic examples. It's not like, it's because ultimately everything is one, therefore we need to start from the one. It's actually that if you want to hit some wood with a hammer, you need to touch the wood with the hammer. And if they touch, you need to consider them as a system at some point, right? So it's a weird kind of defense of unity or conjunction, which is not really like you get conjunction or unity preceding division, but you don't get harmony with unity, right? Like you do need to make things touch. They need to have material linkage for one to interact or propagate with one another, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily cohere, right? So I think it's a weird mixture of these.
I feel the way I understood the way like he solves this problem of how do you distinguish between what organized and what's being organized, between spontaneity and design, is because he solves that with his concept of organization as both activity and resistance. So
yeah.
It always assumes a perspective of the complex. So you always have to situate the complex, which is like the entity you're analyzing, from what resists to it. So it's what from the perspective of a complex appears as resistance, then everything that's not the complex is spontaneous, is resistance, is whatever it acts against it is disorganization. So I feel he ends up with this really perspectival view of organization.
Yeah, I agree. No, I totally agree. I think that in the second chapter, this really becomes clear when he talks about sort of basic concepts, right? Because in the beginning of the second chapter, also just one thing before we move to the second chapter, I didn't realize that he writes in a footnote that the word tektology comes from Hegel. I don't know where in Hegel you find that.
I didn't see this.
Yeah.
What page is that?
And my version is footnote 2 on page 19. Here.
No, Heckel, not.
Whoa, in my copy, I swear to you, it's written Hegel.
In mine, it's written Heckel. Like
mine is definitely the better copy. You won't be able to read because there's probably.
Yeah, I see it. Hey, wow.
Somebody was reading. I mean, I could definitely believe I read it wrong, but Heckel makes more sense than Hegel.
How did Heckel get turned into Hegel, man? What the fuck?
What the hell?
Weird.
I bet they used OCR like image to text and somehow didn't translate it.
Yeah, mine is the first edition, and this is the second one. So mine is the one that's not corrected. So they corrected it for the one that's in the PDF. Unfortunately, I all for propagating this mistake. And if you guys ever want the quotes so you can propagate it, let me know. I can give you the page number. So clearly Hegel used the word. Yeah, but I totally agree with you. Like in the beginning of chapter 2, when he talks about where is the the actual statement. It's really good. He says, I mean, considering the 3 chapters, I still think the second one was the most profound yet for me. But he begins with that idea of expediency, right? And talking about purpose, the problem of purpose, and then he says, well, I think that I remember we kind of came up with this. Yeah.
No, there's a quote that he uses: if 2 armies or 2 classes are engaged in a struggle, then the activities of each side represents resistance for the other. The whole matter is but a question of the point of view taken.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So we get this sort of perspective approach to what's resistance and what is action, right? Then we get this sort of he talks about this, the idea, I forget, I remember I had this kind of annotated here, but I probably won't find it, where he talks about this idea that the what counts as a part is also local, and it depends on what is relevant for the organism, right? I just wanted to find. Yeah, I mean, I think that the final statement, the sort of theory of relativity version statement of the resistance and action thing is this one, right? When he says organized activities and resistances, in essence, they express one and the same thing, right? So to resist and to act in some sense is indistinguishable until you kind of fixate which perspective you're talking from, right? And then he gives this idea here, which I call logical atomism, in the sense that what counts as an element, right? The concept of elements in the organization of science is completely relative and conditional. It is simply those parts into which, in conformity with the problem under the investigation, it was necessary to decompose its object. They may be as large as small as needed. They may be subdivided further or not. No limits to analysis can be placed here. Right? So I think that's the second big principle he introduces, this idea that what counts as a part, what counts as a component for an organization is actually defined by the functions and the actual logic of the organization, and not by some necessary substrate, right? Then I think that the third big principle he introduces in this chapter, which is already kind of at play in the first one, is this idea that there is, I mean, through cooperation or through the combination of organizations, you can change that ratio of action to resistance, right? And in 2 senses. You can, for example, combine workers to lift a rock they couldn't lift separately, and therefore, let's say, increase their action over the rock's resistance in a proportion that is no longer individually distributed, so they can lift together a rock they couldn't lift separately. So it's kind of like an objective overcoming of an objective resistance. But he also talks about something we when we first read this, we discussed it in a more I think we went into a discussion on Twitter, in fact, about Twitter. But I think that once Dennis and I were writing the primer, I realized how important it was, because he talks about this sort of subjective resistance being lowered. So he says the capacity to mimic another worker, for example, lowers the internal resistance of the worker, because you don't need to fully process or decide on an action. You can kind of bypass that decision process by copying someone else. I don't remember where that is, but I think it's here somewhere, probably earlier than this. here when he talks about in a joint. So as far as psychic influences on cooperation are concerned, they're related to the inner resistance of the organism. Laboring alone, the worker undertakes and carries out all actions in his own initiative, his own stimuli. For each new act, he has to appropriately tune his nervous muscular apparatus quite independently. In a joint effort, however, a considerable part of this process of adaptation goes on at the expense of imitation, that is, in a much more mechanical and automatic way, so that for the imitating worker, the inner resistances of his organism are considerably smaller. So there is an idea of that cooperation also cuts corners on cognition or sort of planning or organizing of how we should act in response to a certain situation, right? It reminded me a lot of that, I think, Bordoni guy that Pedro was studying, and he presented to me with this idea that biased rationality can be thought of as a sort of economy for cognition, right? Having certain biases can actually help you cut corners and have actually sort of more efficient way of reasoning in situations where going through the full kind of reasoning process and the deciding process would take a long time and perhaps make some situations not only slower but possibly just unfeasible. And I think that we captured a bit of this in the primer when we introduced this idea of resolution boxes for workers, which on the one hand was about a sort of feedback structure that allows you to account for the fact that when you're working on something, you are objectively tuning your work to make it, let's say, more efficient. If you're hammering something, every time you hammer, you can also get back and try hammering better the next time. But it allows us to kind of sync or think the idea of syncing the resolution box of many workers. For example, through singing work songs and things like this, they kind of establish a sort of collective criteria for the rhythm of work that kind of shares that process of fine-tuning or kind of adapting your work amongst everyone who's working, right? So I don't know, it reminded me a lot of this idea.
And also the idea of the socially necessary labor use, which we came up with as like a middle term for like this average worker. I wonder if that also is a kind of imitation. You're kind of imitating the average worker when because of the pressure of needing to extract value from the worker, right? Or you force the worker to have to imitate this.
Like work on the clock, right? For example.
Yeah.
The average also becomes, I think, a strategy for a lot of workers, because in some environments, you target the average in order not to get penalized for being too low, and in order not to be asked to do more than what you're paid to do if you're performing too highly.
Yeah, it's true.
So there's a subjective, or there's a worker side kind of norm too, and that often kind of goes in struggle when you talk about slowdowns or whatnot between competing norms of the Mises or what have you.
Well, one thing that I find very amazing in this is that he takes one insight that was very much associated with Freud. Freud was supposedly somebody who took this seriously very early on and would be like a pioneer on this idea. Because Freud is like one of the basic insights of Freud is that the problem for the psychic apparatus is not resistance from the outside, but resistance from the inside. So it's not the problem of stimulation through the perceptual system. That sort of excitement can be shut off to a great degree through actions, right? And for him, the external included feeling hungry. That's external for Freud. So if you're hungry, you can eat. If it's too bright, you can leave or do something. But the internal stimulation that comes from inside the psychic apparatus itself, and it doesn't necessarily mean like neurological, because in some sense you could also say that insofar it's not part of the interiority of the psychic apparatus, it's not really interior stimuli, but there is a source of stimulation that is constant, and you cannot shut it off because it's, let's say, bound with the material substratum of the psychic apparatus itself, right? So that idea that the problem of the psychic problems that psychoanalysts are interested have to do with shifting that perspective. It's not the external stimuli, but the internal one that is the core problem, right? Bogdanov is very clear of this, and I don't think he mentions Freud, and I think this is actually not really, like, I don't think he could have read the text where Freud is dealing with this, like beyond the pleasure principle and texts like those. I think there were published after this, if I'm not mistaken, in fact. But you get that same idea, right? That kind of you have the objective resistance, but the way that something is structured can also be a resistance to certain adaptations or some problems, right? For me, it reads very nicely with Freud without the sort of without falling into the usual problem of, well, once you take the point of view of the internal structure of that psychic apparatus, you even lose what's outside. You can no longer, the outside is just a reconstruction of representative reconstruction of the outside, and you get entangled with those things. Here, it's kind of like the organizational point of view doesn't seem to really worry that much about the difference between internal and external. I say this because there is a quote in page, I was kind of struck by it. On page 81, on a footnote, it says this here, which I found very, very strong, a statement. It says, in tektology, the word external does not have a spatial meaning. I mean, that's a strong statement, you know. So when we're talking about external resistance, internal resistance, that shouldn't be spatially distinguished, right? I think once he develops the idea of conjunctions and complexes and stuff in chapter 3, you get the feel that something is internal if it's, let's say, functionally part of a complex, right? It's not really a spatial distinction. Yeah, anyway, so after he presents these 3 big principles, I think they're all very crucial, right? The sort of perspectivism of resistance and action, this idea that parts are contextually defined, and the idea that transformations can affect both external resistance, but also sort of internal resistance. And we have now this idea that, well, that doesn't really necessarily mean spatial, it means it has some other meaning. Then he goes into that distinction between 3 forms of complexes, right? What he calls the organized complexes, when the sum is greater than the parts. Neutral complexes, when the sum is equal, the whole is equal to the sum of the parts. And disorganized complexes, when the sum is smaller than the parts, right? The whole is smaller than the sum of the parts. He then identifies mathematics as the science of neutral complexes. So I think we also discussed this last time, that he talks about mathematics very much in a 19th century kind of way, right? You find in Hegel, for example, the definition that mathematics is a science of magnitudes. And he used that kind of jargon to talk about mathematics. And then he uses the example that, well, every sum, the whole of a sum is also always the sum of the parts that were added. So in that sense, mathematics is committed to what he calls neutral complexes. And he deduces the ideality or the sort of removal of mathematics from the real world because of that. Because in the real world, complexes are actually either organized or disorganized. In no way, in no situation, there is a pure coincidence between the sum of the parts and the whole, right? He gives the example of the potato sack or something like that, and the idea that in no situation adding two potato sacks actually gives you the exact sum of the potatoes you have, because you lose something, they're changing entropy or whatever, right? So he makes a distinction between tektology and mathematics in the sense that mathematics, it's a double argument, right? The first argument is that mathematics deals with neutral complexes. Then he says, because of this, since they don't exist, mathematics is a secondary to tektology. So it's both regional in the sense that it is only deals with one structure, and tektology deals with these three types of complexes, and the complex that mathematics deals with would have the particular quality of not existing, right? But it's still a much more friendly, I'd say, relation than the one he has with philosophy, because he makes two critiques of philosophy. The first is that it's a dated proposition, outdated, in fact, right? In the first chapter, he gives that theory of tektology and says, well, we begin with primitive methods of organization. As society gets more complex, we have a sort of central authority, and with monotheistic religions, they kind of, everything is kind of formed around the idea of command and obedience. God commands, we obey. We command over nature, nature obeys. People command over each other. And then you get a sort of bourgeois world, early bourgeois world with kind of proliferation of many forms of knowledge and division of labor, specialization of society. And philosophy for a while is the theory that can unify all these different fields, right? So he kind of mentions natural philosophers and this idea that you could still be like a philosopher like Spinoza, Hegel, Kant, people who wrote on all topics like Leibniz or whatever, right? It's a very specific period where it seems like a philosopher can know about everything and can come up with a theory that connects everything around one central perspective. And I feel like his position is that this is a sort of, I wouldn't say reactionary, but it's a sort of counter movement to bourgeois world being formed. The more the bourgeois world forces division of labor, division of knowledge, you have this sort of aristocratic kind of remnants of individuals who try to see the whole, see it across the divisions of knowledge, right? And then he kind of says, well, but rather than looking back from the division of labor and knowledge to the unification of what's beneath, he says tektology is the sort of communist version, what comes after the division of labor. So after a capitalist society, what the proletariat would need is a way to take advantage of what's different about all forms of knowledge, rather than trying to kind of unify them as if they're all the same, they deal with the same in principle, to accept that they deal with something totally different. There is no one substance, right? And what is left of philosophy is to, let's say, be the theory of the thing that all these fields have in common, which can no longer be a substance, can only be the fact that they're all forms of organization, right? I really like the way he talks about popular tektology as a sort of use of popular sayings and metaphors to transport like an organizational technology from one situation to another, as a sort of already kind of more developed, perhaps, perspective than philosophy in some senses, because it's more internal to the division of labor and division of knowledge. You're kind of locally moving around and seeing how one thing can be used in another. But it kind of sets up, I think, that the challenge of tektology would be to take up the role of philosophy, but from a perspective that would be kind of purified or filtered from the bourgeois illusions that were still kind of behind the modern philosophical project, right? Which he kind of identifies with this general, like, unifying perspective with some substantial background, I think, to unify everything. He says this more in the first chapter. In this second chapter, I think the focus that he gives to criticize philosophy is that philosophy cannot build experiments. And tektology can have experiments because there is such a thing as organizing experiments, right? Organizational experiments. Then very quickly he goes through, he says that the organizational point of view is above all a way of reformulating questions. And he gives three examples. One is the question of the origin of sleep. The other, there is the labor theory of value. And the third is in a footnote, a very brief critique to Einstein. Like, I mean, these guys really, they were in a special position of feeling like they could comment on Einstein, like, and sleep soundly at night. So there is a footnote on page 52 where he's kind of saying, yeah, Einstein is a very smart fellow, but it seems to me like the formulations of the principle of relativity are imperfect. But generally, I mean, if you read quickly, like the three examples, I have the impression that all of them, I mean, the labor one is not that clear. For him, the labor value, if I'm not mistaken, what is missing is an investigation of the conditions of mutual exchange under which enterprises are able to maintain and increase their share of work. It's kind of like, yeah, it's kind of like a theory of, I think, technological development, like the sharing of technological development by capitalist enterprise. It's not very clear what he means by what tektology allows you to see of what would be new in labor theory of value. In the origin of sleep, it's a bit clearer because he shows that you shouldn't be looking to the sleeper alone to understand what sleep is. You would have to include the environment. And once you realize that the world has some cycle and these things are relevant to how sleep is what he calls the totality of external conditions for each organism, right? In fact, you know, he's actually, if I'm not mistaken, he's kind of claimed to be the guy who first developed the theory of the environment. I've read this more than once. But anyway, I think that there you can see that he thinks that if you take the organizational perspective, something about this relation between an organism or an organization and its outside is reframed, right? I think that it goes through the perspective change that Renzo was talking about, but I also think it's useful to kind of think about the difference between changing perspective between two organizations, right? You have like two people pushing each other. One registers the action of the other as reaction and vice versa, right? And the difference between that and the relation between organization and environment, which I think it's partially the same, but also doesn't necessarily kind of coincide, right? The environment is not simply, let's say, another organization, but I think he doesn't get into that at this point. Then he gives this sort of methods for tektology, right? I think these are the four things I remember, like this idea of generalization. You take some particular organization and you learn something that is more general than than that particular phenomena. I'm not sure which example that he gives. Statistical methods, finding recurrence, and he called it quantitative enumeration of facts and calculation of their recurrence. Then he talks about the abstractly analytical, which is to find basic laws. Which I think is the one that he says he privileges. But I don't remember where the quote is. And I don't know why he privileges it. And then he talks about the fact that one thing that separates philosophy from tektology is that there are such things as organizational experiments. And he also claims that because sometimes people have a reduced vision of what an experiment is, the fact that mathematics, which he calls a tektology of neutral combinations, it's overwhelmingly, in mathematics, it is so overwhelmingly great that it has, for the majority of thinkers, completely overshadowed the experimental basis of the science. So for him, mathematics is also an experimental science. Yeah, I think from this chapter, that's it, really, right? The next chapter, I mean, I really liked it, but it's much more kind of constrained, like very kind of direct, I think, compared to this one, which is still very broad and has like very basic principles. Here, you start getting this sort of kind of operators, right? And I love that you can see that it really is his method to say something like conjunction. There's actually a good quote. He says, here he says this, page 65. Like I think this is very telling of his style. It's necessary to perceive distinctively the universality of the concept of conjunction, right? In order to operate with it tektologically. And then he said, conjunction is cooperation or any other social contact, such as speech and the connection of concepts into ideas, the meeting of images and aspirations in the field of consciousness, the fusion of metals, electrical discharge between two bodies, an exchange of goods between enterprises, an exchange of ray energy between heavenly bodies. Conjunction binds our mind with the most distant planets which we see in the telescope, and with the smallest bacteria which we see in the microscope. Conjunction is the assimilation of nourishment which sustains an organism and of poison which destroys it. I mean, I like, he has this sort of, he has an affirmative use for something that in post-war philosophy, we have only a negative one, which is like Foucault making use of Borges' crazy lists, you know, like lists of improbable things in the same category. Things seem so far-fetched, they couldn't be in the same, possibly be cataloged together. And I feel like with Bogdanov, he makes weird lists in hope that you see something universal in the form of everything he's listing, right? Like you should be seeing something universal that goes from cooperation or any social contact, electrical discharge between two bodies, soft embracers of lovers and mad embracers of enemies, and the binding of your mind with the most distant planet through the telescope. Like it is pretty out there. But at the same time, I mean, from the perspective of, for anyone who read Logics of Worlds, I feel at home with this because, you know, he also says you should take this as, right, scientifically organizational concepts are as strictly formal as the mathematical concepts, which in fact are a category of those, right? So after he gives you this long list, you kind of need to, he concludes that the only thing they can have in common is formal. It cannot be substantially the same process. In some sense, operationally, it cannot be the same process. I think
In
that
the last line, he does go through the other truth procedures. He talks about the embraces of lovers and also of the congress of workers. So
yeah. It's true. It's true. Yeah, so I mean, this chapter for me is very logics of worldview. Like, there is one distinction that, I mean, I had the luck that Dennis mentioned to me this chapter from that 7 sketches book. There's like chapter 7, which is about behavior types. I forgot how it's called, right? And
Yeah.
when you get to a bit later on in this chapter, when he talks about selection as a general principle, it really seems like selection is a sort of update process, a temporarily updating process where some things get lost, some things get preserved from, like, temporarily, right? It kind of reminded me of that. But
Definitely.
I remember
filtering.
It really has a similar feel. But I remembered it because I think it explains something about what he means by formal as well. Because he says on page 75, he gives this really cool list of things, right? He's talking about conservation and selection, and he wants to introduce the idea of selection again as a universal idea. And then he goes through climate changes in a country, and then some animals and plants survive, others perish. The entry of a man who didn't live in this country, like didn't live in an environment, he kills some organisms and blah blah blah. A city is subjected to fire. An ear of barley with its beard in a downward position is thrust into the sleeve of the clothing of a walking man. A box in which lie irregular pieces of broken sugar. A man falls into a difficult situation. That's like an example. If a man falls into a difficult situation in a society with separate classes, like a class society, and after he gives you all these weird examples where he wants you to get the idea that something is preserved, something is thrown away, or whatever, you get this this last paragraph where he says, it is easy to see the technological scheme of selection differs from the natural selection of biologists only in the necessary simplification or reduction. Biological selection assumes propagation to be related to heredity. The general organizational scheme cannot include this because propagation is a special feature of living organisms. Right, so I think that here you get a nice idea where you're taking a formal approach to arrive at what is in common between all these different situations. But let's say what propagates selection is the regional thing that will kind of filter from the general technology to the specific field, right? If you ask about what sort of selection is propagated through heredity, this will lead you to biology, like turn the technological point of view into the biology point of view, right? That reminded me, Dennis, of what we were talking about, and I think I was also talking to Thiago about this the other day, like the idea that you might have a general logic, and then you ask about what are the forms of concrete compositionalities that actually propagate that logic, right? For example, you have the exchange function we came up for commodity exchange, but that logic in pure form is actually totally inconsistent. But once you find the proper means of propagation of commodity form, which is commodity production, meaning commodities composing to become more commodities, you find a sort of material channel through which you can propagate coherent relations of value, right? Similar with what we were talking about kinship, the idea that there's something about reciprocity which is explosive and inconsistent and creates infinite perspectives, and kinship structures can be thought of as a sort of special channel. It's accidental, but it's still, let's say, localized in such a way that what generates a person is also reproduces the generative principle, right? So kin can produce new kin and so on. So if you now localize that inconsistent logic on this sort of propagating mechanism, you get to establish more coherent forms of reciprocity, right? So it has I think it has a similar feel to this idea that you can have a very general principle formulated in purely kind of transcendental terms, but what makes it what gives it the specificity of being the object of study of a given field, right? Or even the characteristics that it takes in a given realm of reality has to do with the material kind of conditions for the propagation of selection, for example, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting.
You might find.
Yeah, in the case of value and the propagation of like this consistent propagation thing, it seems like it happens in this, or at least one way we can think of it is it can divide it into cycles, right? Where you produce something and then you may in the first instance produce too much, or you may produce too little, and then there is some kind of fluctuation around some ideal. And the ideal is defined as the equal basically to the labor input of that thing, right? So it's almost like it converges to this selection thing. Like selection, I'm just bringing this up because selection is not instantaneous. It's something that, or in some cases, it requires time to become, for its mechanism to take place, right?
Yeah, I think he even goes into this, if I'm not mistaken. I think he makes a distinction between cognitive selection and physical selection at some point by saying that it's clear that the cost of selection for ideas is smaller, right? You can have a lot of ideas. You can easily kind of go from one form to another in thought because the cost is smaller than the cost to change in other kind of material structures, something like that. I wanted to find where he says this. Yeah, he says it's just before digression. He says that cognition is more plastic. Cognition operates with complexes which are much more plastic, and in its field, which has it's based the same field of physical labor, expands much faster and easier. Therefore, it develops its chain of ingressions correspondingly faster and easier. Like, I mean, we skipped this, right? But ingression means creating a common part between two things, right? Again, an increasingly shorter period of time, right? By establishing ever new connections where they were previously absent and crossing in its unifying work any given boundaries in an increasingly shorter period of time, cognition has long ago arrived at the idea of continuous connection of all that exists, at the idea of a universal ingression. I like that he makes a bit of a critique here. He says also that in the previous page, he says, whenever possible, cognition directly blends the common elements of a given complex, which is called generalization, right? So if in one field of thought there was psychic images of water in a river, water in a stream, water in one or another vessel, then the linkage between all of them occurs as if by means of superimposition of one image to another, creating unity in the form of great number of coinciding elements. And I think that in this longer paragraph, he suggests, as he did before, that the very fact that cognition can take very little time to generalize can also be a problem, right? Because he explains in the first chapter that for him, part of the difficulty with tektology or tektological thinking in let's say capitalist times or advanced capitalism is that it's not that easy to generalize. Like if you know a small bit of the world and a small bit of knowledge, that doesn't give you the tools to directly generalize that field and say that it is the common kind of the perspective from which you can see how everything works, right? Yeah, but anyway, I think that this here it gets kind of schematic, right? It gives you these two mechanisms, conjunction and disjunction. So given two systems or two complexes, you get conjunction when they either totally superpose into one another, or they superpose and cancel each other out by doing that, like two waves that are inverted and they cancel each other, or they are, what's usually the case, they join and partially add up and partially disorganize one another. And he talks about disjunction, which would be the inverse case, but he says that disjunction is always preceded by conjunction. I thought that this is an important point of his, which is, again, it doesn't seem to be an ontological argument about there is one, because on the one hand, he has a perspectivist approach in this where there is a resistance. So there is two, right? If there was only one thing, there would be nothing to resist. And it's weird. I mean, it doesn't seem like a classic kind of problem of beginning in philosophy or ontology. But on the other hand, in a sort of operational approach, even if you want to divide, you need to get in touch first, right? I would say that that's perhaps his sort of kind of more classic materialist idea, right? I mean, you cannot change something you cannot touch, or you're not, in some sense, interacting with. So he gives this sort of double definition of conjunction, that it's both universal, and I'm not sure now, I wrote diversity, but I don't remember how he introduces the, he says that, well, it's universal, but it doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing as antagonistic conjunction, right? It's sort of very heterogeneous forms of conjunction. It's not again, conjunction is not the same as harmonization, right? And that's why he gives you different cases where two things can be conjoined in kind of perfect addition. They can be, nothing is lost. They can be canceling each other. They can be partially arranging each other and so on. He then defines ingression as the result of conjunction from the standpoint of the emergent system, right? So not really the act of two things getting together, but ingression as the emergence of a common part. So ingression would be a sort of, right, entry into. This gives him this idea of the linkage of different complexes, and he defines ingression as the creation of a common part between two complexes. And then he covers what we just mentioned, right? The cognitive generalization as the blending of common parts of complexes, which would be like the union of all common parts, right? He talks about something that I thought was very important. He goes very far with this idea of instrumental ingression, right? A sort of intermediate process that might be needed to allow two things to have a common part. He says, let's see, I thought it was the same page. Oh yeah, it's here. Cognition. Yeah, cognition derives its methods from practice. Let us assume that it's necessary to connect firmly two pieces of metal or wood or a rope. linkage is created by the entry of elements of one complex into another. To carry out such an entry directly is not always possible and at times impossible. In the case of ropes, this is, for example, easily achieved by weaving the fibers of both, or by tying their ends together. The simplicity and ease depend on the greater relative mobility of their parts. It is not so simple with two pieces of metal. Their elements under normal conditions have very little mobility. And if the form of the pieces are not particularly suitable for welding, as in the case of a nut and bolt, this cannot be directly carried out. But technology knows methods of changing molecular mobility. Pieces of metal can either be completely melted down, permitting their fusion, blah, 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 blah. However, it's not possible to connect two pieces of wood in this way. They are irreversibly destroyed with heating before acquiring the requisite plasticity. In such cases, the method of introductory or instrumental complexes is usually applied. This role can be performed, for example, by glue, which in a liquid form easily attaches itself to the surface of the wood and then hardens without destroying. So instrumental ingression would be when a third thing works as the common part of two other things, right? You get a sort of intermediate, again, a very gluing, very kind of clear example of how this would play out, right? But then he goes very far in this and says things like, well, with the use of instrumental mediations like this, man can create practical ingressions. He says, man can create practical ingressions only in the field of his collective laboring muscular efforts, only in a limited framework. But this framework is being expanded with the progress of labor. Besides, experience shows that by means of one or many introductory links, right, these intermediate things, which are expediently chosen, it is possible to establish a real connection between any complexes, no matter how far they are removed in the field of labor or how mutually incompatible in the direction of their activities. It is possible to coordinate the efforts of two workers who happen to be at the two opposite sides of the earth. It is only necessary to introduce between them a sufficient number of telegraphic stations and lines. It is possible to arrange a parley between fiercely fighting enemies. It is only necessary to find suitable intermediaries. It is possible to obtain a mutual understanding and precise coordination of actions between an Eskimo and a Papuan, between an English worker and a Russian peasant. To do this, knowledgeable and intelligent interpreters are necessary. It is possible to connect fire and water in the preparation of food and tender cells of the brain centers and steel instruments for production or destruction. So instrumental ingression is important, yes. Yeah, then he talks about disingression, right? Which is when you have the creation of a boundary between things that previously had a common part. I remember he makes an important statement here about, complete disingression. And it's very strong, what he has to say about the idea of environments. He says there can be no complexes which are completely isolated. So just as there is no purely disorganized system, there can be no organized system that is not surrounded by something, right? There is no, one falls on the side of non-being, right? Pure disorganization, but organized without a sort of a medium also doesn't exist, right? He says there's always an environment, and even the idea of pure empty space, it makes no sense. Modern science shows that this is not the case. You can have forces acting on bodies even in the void and so on. So again, he puts this ingression at a secondary level, because even if you're creating a boundary or separating, you're still going to be in contact with the environment. And then he has this sort of, I think this is, I mean, he goes a bit more into this, again, he's said to be the precursor of an idea of feedback systems. He goes more into it in another chapter, but the idea of dynamic stability and the idea of feedback both appear already in Tektology, right? So first he introduces this two idea of crisis. So when two systems which have a boundary between them lose the boundary and one creates an ingression or conjunction into another, that's a crisis C. And when a new boundary established would be a disjunctive crisis, which is a crisis D, right? And again, crisis C has precedence over D. The conjunction precedes the disjunction, right? Then he introduces something that I find very interesting the way he does it. He talks about this regulative mechanism, and he says, well, we don't want to think about conservation in the sense of something which is simply steady. I think the very idea of environment that he already introduced prevents that he would have now a more naive theory of conservation, right? And he introduces first this idea of, well, what can be, I think first conservative selection seems, I think, a bit more, no, it doesn't. Conservative selection is also dynamic, but even before he talks about it, he just talks about selection in general, I think. He gives this definition that, well, we want a general theory of selection, which is kind of, right, it has three elements: the object of selection, that which is being kind of either conjoined, separated, which is losing a part or adding a part to. And he gives examples, again, his great lists: living organisms in Darwin's scheme, buildings and structures in the case of an earthquake, shifts of things in the examples of the ear of barley in the box of sugar, connections and correlations of things in technical selection of labor, connections and interrelations amongst people in the selection during social struggle. Then you have the agent or factor of selection, which acts on the object of selection by preserving or destroying it, such as living conditions can be an actor or an agent or a factor, mechanical resistance, activity of people in industrial selection, so on. And then the basis of selection, which is the aspect of the object on which depends its preservation or elimination. And I like that he uses the same theory to talk about truth values at some point. I wanted to find where he says this. Here he says, reflection, meditation, and the solution of questions consists precisely in the fact that from a great many combinations entering the field of thought, certain are accepted as successful or true, and others are rejected as erroneous or false. So the general theory of selection for him, if you take inference, deduction, and so on to be means of propagating constraints of some sort, right? If I said P, there are a bunch of things that don't follow from P, right? That would be a means of propagating some constraint. So you can have also a theory of truth selection, right?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting because he's like building a topos in his way of talking.
It's very toposy, isn't it?
It's very toposy, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to get like too excited when I read this guy because I always despise it's everything there approach to reading old books, but I would say that there's a lot this guy was onto, like very early on. But I like this idea and that general selection, the theory of general selection, it has all those ideas that we mentioned, right? Perspectivism of reaction and action. What counts as a part is contextually defined. I mean, this appears here as this idea of basis of selection, right? The basis of selection, the aspect that is efficacious, right, changes depending on what's at stake. You have that idea of different types of organization, and you can have sort of classical organizations which are neutral, right? You can have disorganized and organized organizations, and then selection seems to give it a sort of updating, very broad updating rule, right? For kind of temporal moments or something like that. And I mean, even this idea of, restricting a sort of free associative space cognition to some combinations which are accepted as successful or true. Successful or true, I find that also very computational of him, you know. And yeah, so then he talks about these three ideas of like the three aspects of what he calls general selection, and then he goes into conservative selection and says, well, it's not like stuff gets static here. It's a dynamic theory of, it's a theory of change that preserves form, right? So in no case is it considered the case where nothing changes. It's only the case where the same form is constantly re-updated, right? You have a dynamic equilibrium of changes, he says. But he shows that this is kind of idealized, even though it's already kind of sophisticated. It has an idea of, you know, change that keeps something alive or so on. He says that because of the environment, right? He says in this first paragraph on progressive selection, precise preservation does not exist, and approximate preservation means only practically small changes in the direction of the preponderance of assimilation over disassimilation or vice versa. So to keep a form alive, it's always going to change a bit, and it can either tend towards the previous form it already had, right? These changes on the whole are kind of small with compared to the already established form, or the inverse, you tend towards the new form. But then he concludes that it's generally difficult to apply the scheme to those cases. No, so already this makes the scheme of conservative selection scientifically inadequate, and it can be proved that the real preservation of forms in nature is possible only through their progressive development. So ultimately, not even dynamic preservation can be conservative, because you cannot, it only seems the case if you take the organization separate from the environment. If you take the organization with the environment, and the environment therefore changes, then you need to itself, this already implies that conservation, the very form needs to change, not only the material substrate of the form, right?
At this point, I felt a little bit that, like, either he was kind of like lacking a concept of stability, like the fact that something is in equilibrium doesn't mean you can it can either be an unstable equilibrium, and this means that eventually the system will disorganize or like something dissipate or keep growing. But you could also have stable equilibrium in which you would have the forces that could stabilize for like infinite amounts of time. So on the other hand, I thought that it also worked for like a kind of progressivist like view of structures, in which you had to like, if you had full, like he uses this argument, like if in practice quick and slow disintegration have quite different meaning for us, but in scientific analysis this difference is only the question of a coefficient, like, no. And then afterwards, like he gives, like, it seems that conservative selection is just a matter of like imperfect knowledge. If you were to know everything, then you would know the direction that the process is going. Like he even gives the example, like in the end of like there are some certain situations in which one is more useful than the other. There in situations that you cannot like distinguish a direction, then you're left with conservative selection. But at the same time, he makes like the caveat that progressive, he's using not in the sense of progress, but in the sense of progression.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if there are like so like political implications, in the sense that he privileges like a view of organization that needs to grow, and that needs to, like, an economy that needs to grow. And
yeah, I didn't think in that term, but I totally agree with you that there is something weird, because I mean, on the one hand, the next chapter is about stability, right?
Mm.
It's about diffusion, equilibrium, and stability. But I mean, it's kind of, from what I remember, it's still like kind of rough. But I perhaps I didn't understand the difference between conservative and progressive selection, because I mean, the examples he gives of the way I understood it, it's simply to mean the difference between a form stays the same while its material substrate changes, like a whirlpool that has a form even though all the molecules of water are changing. That would be conservative to some point. It's dynamic and it has some attractor, some form, but that form would be stable. But that is actually like a very poor snapshot, right, of the phenomena, because if you consider it in a bit broader perspective, there is only the form while there is the water. So at some point, the whirlpool will no longer be there, or something like this, you know? Like
I'm wondering if maybe this is a moment of where he's trying to make a polemic that maybe makes things more complex than not, because the way I read conservative selection, what he was doing was trying to push against an older idea that you get from kind of a simple Darwinism, that you have these static things called species, and then these moments of change between species, but the kind of like normal thing is the static moment. And so he's trying to show essentially through a statistical argument that because the overall number of connections that are going to be made are more likely to be disorganizing than organizing, the only way to really stay as something is to constantly change overall. But he really just seems to be arguing that there's really no such thing as conservative selection, and that all selection is progressive at some level. It's just a matter of what scale you're looking at, and he just doesn't really execute the argument as clearly as he could. That's the way I read the thing.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get what you're saying, because there is in page 80, there is that very weird moment that he talks about eternity and a bird and a mountain made of diamond. That's kind of like, that's a kind of, you know, that's a weird example of anything. You know, when he gives the idea of it, even if you take the sort of bird cleaning its beak on the top of the diamond mountain, that's actually disorganization, right? Even if it takes kind of almost forever. So that seems like a rhetorical argument against something, right? Rather than a. So I mean, it seems like it fits what you're saying to me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, at this point that he passes to the progressive selection as the kind of like more privileged and truer version, he uses this really artificial and ideal argument about the mountain.
Yes. Yeah, it's true. The previous paragraph says it can be proven that real preservation of forms in nature is possible only through progressive development. In an Eastern fable, the notion about eternity, like that's the part about where the proof was going to be introduced. Yeah, the way that I understood it is that, I mean, after the example in the next paragraph, he says that the environment can by no means be unconditionally stable. It is connected with the current world of events, and with strict analysis, it's present the end to the entire universe. Consequently, the environment inevitably changes. And it feels to me that that's the point, right? That if the environment inevitably changes, it's not enough simply to, let's say, have a dynamic equilibrium to remain, to conserve a form, because the environment will, let's say, change the form of the resistance, not only the material of the world, right? I understood the passage, honestly, I understood the passage from conservative selection to progressive, simply as saying you cannot conserve forms and keep the material dynamic. The form needs to be dynamic in some level, because it is in an environment, and the environment is not simply making material changes, but it's also changing the forms, right? So conservative selection would be like saying that, well, your body keeps, you know, its basic anatomic form and basic function of organs, but the actual cells are changing all the time. but that's still an abstract idea because it's not only, you know, the material of a form that is changing. You're interacting with forms all the time, and they are changing, and that's also changing the form of the body, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's curious that the examples he gives, like in the last, I didn't understand, he talks about pedagogy, but like the examples of the second scheme, which is progressive, is psychology, theory of economic growth, and theory of ideology, which are like, I feel that there are examples that are really deal with like social forms becoming like hegemonic in the space. And so I don't know, I thought it served like this weird reason, but I didn't understand why he talks about pedagogy. And
yeah, the pedagogy part, that paragraph, I think we should probably read it together. It's a very weird one. He gives a very specific reason why conservative, even though he said all these bad things about it, or said it's kind of inexistent, there is a reason to use it, which is the fact that here, although, as we have seen, the conservative scheme of selection is less perfect than the progressive scheme, it does not follow that it is always more correct and expedient to apply the latter. Conservative selection is especially related, both in practice and in theory, to the question of development of given complexes. Yeah, I think this is it, man. Like the example I gave about the form of the body taken alone, right? In a more abstract sense, and the form of the body in an real environment. That's kind of the problem of development of the complex, right? So there is a normal internal development of a body, so to speak, right? Which will take a certain path, no matter how the environment around it materially changes. So you need some intake of protein, some intake of this and that. That's constantly being renewed, and the body has some shape that is kind of preserved and internally kind of developing due to that material intake. So the matter changes, but the form or the logic of the form stays. But if you now look at a body in an actual environment, right, with heat, other people, contact, and what he calls like all the worldly events, right? That was actually the imperfect point of view, because you're not simply, forms don't simply change due to their internal logic, but they also change due to the logic of other forms. And that would be the progressive scheme, right? So for example, a murderer is somebody with a knife, which has a very specific form, and if it goes into you, it can get in the way of you keeping your form. So that's, let's say, doing some karate in that situation might be a way to progressively preserve a form, right? So that perhaps explains why pedagogy, right? Because it is kind of concerned with internal development, right, of the child, for example. Like that's how I understand this idea of development.
yeah, and how would you understand the next lines?
Yeah, because then you want your external action on it, right? This is important because development may practically depend on your actions. So you want to interfere on the child, or like a doctor, you want to interfere on a body, but the type of interaction you want to make is one that doesn't change anything, right? It will not require the body to, let's say, adapt to something new. You want to reduce the need for adaptation in some sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. I feel like this is what this could mean, that when the development, so the internal development of a complex practically depends on our actions, which I think is like pedagogy, all orthopedic sort of endeavors, right? You want to interfere, but not to change, but rather to preserve. So you need to know the internal logic of the thing, right?
But he does use the psychology as the second example, right?
Yeah, he says formation of individual psychics.
The theory of the formation, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and then
theory of economic growth and theory. perhaps he was even more advanced than you would expect, that he doesn't assume that the formation of individual psychic apparatus is an internal relation, it's not an internal development, right? I mean, that's what you would have to assume if he's dividing it in this way, right?
There's a note to something he writes on that, so maybe he
In
would
relation to the theory of
explain.
psychic development, I succeeded in showing how many important conclusions are derived from semantic application.
Yeah.
Hedonistic selection, psychic selection. Yeah, I mean, in a certain
I
sense,
also
I'm sorry, in a certain sense, this is very much, Simondon's discussion on individuation, which is kind of a fringe problem between the form of the environment and the, kind of epigenetics kind of approach to things.
Mhm.
That would be like a theory of individuation that doesn't assume that there is an internal form, perhaps, to be just kind of unfolded.
Yeah, it's almost like there's a conservative has a norm and progressive doesn't have a norm, right?
Yeah, it doesn't have an internal norm, right? Like a
Internal norm.
yeah, something like that.
Mhm.
Yeah, because pedagogy means like you have a certain idea of what needs to be taught in order to reach a certain normal level of development, intellectual development or whatever. But with individual psyches, economic growth, and ideologies, there's no normal. It develops, but it doesn't develop according to some plan or ideal.
Yeah, and it also suggests that that there is something about pedagogy that needs to answer to a sort of Bildung, where the main thing that you're developing is internal, but ideology has everything to do with, let's say, answering to external events, right? It's not about propagating an idea so much as using ideas to kind of explain away other phenomena, right?
That's true. Yeah, it's very about connecting with whatever else is happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, take conspiracy theory, right? The idea that anything new that happens, it will shape the ideas, right, of this kind of conspiratory ideology. So it is actually kind of it needs to change to remain what it is in a way that is reacting to the outside, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if he thinks that the theory of individual psychics is more connected to progressive selection than conservative selection, he's a Lacanian more than a Freudian.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's completely a non-homeostatic psyche, right?
Yeah.
Is there something connected in pedagogy as far as like intention and goals that you would also say that something like engineering or like even something kind of more applied like carpentry practices or like sets of like know-hows, since they're concerned, even if in the long arc they progress as science progresses, in the short terms they're reconstructing things, would that be a form of like conservative selection that is you can kind of trace connections to? Because it seems like he's giving examples of sciences that fit in the progressive, that are studying phenomena and are not concerned with the outcomes other than to study the phenomena, whereas pedagogy is a goal-oriented pursuit. So what would be like technical, like the kind of things like engineering or technical crafts or whatnot that have interchange with the sciences, but are also concerned much more with producibility and reproducibility based on
form-feeding activities, right?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. This is something that I'm not clear on, like what should be given prevalence here. Because I mean, again, if you make a chair that is not capable to adapt to its environment, like once somebody sits on it, it's gonna break, you know? I mean, it can be seen as a sort of environmental, like the environment is informing how you design as well. It doesn't need to be like I'm not sure if you need to equate form fitting with conservative. I have the impression that this, for me, this kind of orthopedic or even like medical or chirurgical idea seems more crucial. Like there are situations in which it is useful to abstract away from the environment and think about what sort of interactions or actions you're gonna kind of impose on a system that might preserve its internal development, right? That seems like how doctors interact, or perhaps maintenance of a machine in opposition to building a machine, right? Like if you're designing a machine, it's not really like abstracting away from its environment totally. That would be, I'm not sure if engineering takes that perspective so much, you know. It seems to me like a very orthopedic approach where you want to guide something towards a form or a development that is already there, right?
Well, the
like,
maintenance, electrical work, cable work, that kind of thing, where you're trying to get something
perhaps
back to spec,
yeah,
back to functionality. You have a goal, you have to, you have a goal, but that goal is really just to get it back to working right, you know?
Yeah, for example, let's say that you have an electrical system and there is a difference between keeping the function, but totally changing the wiring so it goes to a different place in the house, right? I mean, that's progressive selection, right? Some paths that previously were the best paths to put the wiring are no longer the best ones because, I don't know, it's raining too much, the wood now it's kind of rotten, it's gonna be like exposed to the weather. So you change it completely to keep it doing the same thing, to still be the wiring of electricity for that house. It's different from what you said, right? Like fixing the wires just because, given the form, given what it already is, you want to interact with it so that it can still be what it was, like developing as it was, right? It seems more orthopedic.
Yeah, no, that would be the difference between being a technician and being a machinist or a builder or something. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, like there is a bit of a difference there. I'm not sure how important it is to him. Also, I love this. I mean, I can't really understand exactly how he applies this here, but there is a footnote on differential calculus, right? Progressive selection of magnitudes. The derivatives are progressive selections of magnitudes. And he used it to distinguish progressive, positive selection, negative selection, right? And a crisis of halting. Yeah, I don't know what this previous example was. But I mean,
No,
I think, yeah, sorry.
I mean, if the thing right above in the difference between conservative and progressive, it seems like the takeaway is it's more useful. Conservative is more useful in the sense of like use value or utility, right?
Why?
Because you're building something from a design or achieving some goal.
But are you guys, you really think that this is so identified, like everything that has a, I mean, I agree that gaining mastery over the development of the future member of society and controlling and systematically directing seems okay, goal-oriented, right?
Yeah.
I agree, and these things here seem like crazy. I agree, but he gave so much precedence to the progressive selection, the idea that somehow this dynamic development also requires the form to change, so on. The way that I understand it is simply to say that conservative is when the form that was already established can be kept, even though the matter that goes into it needs to change. So if you have the wiring of a house, the electrical wiring, a piece of the wire might be cut and you need to substitute it, but the form of the wiring will remain the same, right? So you change the matter, but keep the form. And the progressive one is where the form itself is caught up in the changes for some reason, right? So with wear and tear, the wiring needs to be changed because, I don't know, you're reforming the house, it can no longer be there. I agree that I see that he's kind of identifying the first with like goal-oriented because the form established and you're applying the form. But it seems like the second one is not the inverse of goal-oriented, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. Actually, now that I think about it, maybe the distinction is more between reproducibility and experimentation, because it seems like in the progressive case, you can still have goals, but it's because it's so tied up with an external form of organization that you cannot predict. You can only ever conduct experiments to see what happens there, and then if the result of those experiments is reproducible, then you could formulate like a conservative type of thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, for example, in the case of economic growth, right? I mean, because we're going through that part in Capital now, right? I mean, the way that Marx develops it there is saying like, yes, capital accumulation is an immanent kind of internal valorizing process of capital with itself, but like it depends on, you know, availability of labor, increase in the production of means of production and other conditions without which it cannot happen. And those conditions also shape the organic composition of individual capitals, so it's like you can't really see the change, right? You cannot see, let's say, what's efficacious about the process by simply looking inside the system you're reproducing, right? So like the efficacy of where the changes are coming from come from both inside and outside. The outside is not, let's say, passive matter to the expansion of the form. The outside is also, let's say, active form, right? It informs what goes on. Just as the idea that if you're changing your house, that will inform, right, where the wires can go. It's not like a passive thing and you just set up the wires and that's it. I'm just kind of tending not to oppose the two as too big of a deal. Like, you know, one is goal-oriented, the other is kind of spontaneously changing, and one is more kind of pure reproduction, and the second is like experimental in the sense, like in the epistemological sense, right? The second to me just seems to be like the case where the form changes together or something like that.
Yeah, to be clear, the main reason I was kind of interested in the technical side, I guess, or whatever, maintenance versus science, is got to do with that comment he makes around the probabilities of disorganizing activities. And that essentially you could look at conservative selection as the set of things that have been working up until now, whatever, however you define that, and that progress, but those are actually limited within the overall process of progressive selection, which is really selection overall. Like, I think that's kind of like, I'm trying to read him generously, but somewhat critically. I think it makes sense to say that progressive selection overall is selection, and conservative selection are those kind of, they are reproducible, but it's not an opposition between, the main thing is that they continually are, like, for whatever purpose we're applying, or for whatever reason it is we are doing something in general, they keep working in some very generic sense of the term.
Yeah, I agree with you that progressive selection seems to be pretty much selection. Like, and conservative one seems to be a more specific case where you can master, like, right, it's not even the mastery over a system, it's mastery over the development of something, right? He says this twice, like, you can interfere on kind of the development of something in a way that is not like totally chaotic. So it does seem like more purposeful perhaps than the other cases, right?
I feel, so in the end, I feel that the conservative is kind of like a more local knowledge, and you're more worried about the internal things you can control and establish as goal. and the second one is supposed to be like more global and more able of producing like new forms and this kind of stuff. But I think the thing that makes it weird is because he equates this global form, which is more supposed to be more general, to being like tied to growth. Like he associates positive selection, and he describes it as like a simulation of activities, and it naturally builds up complexity. So the growing complexity and all this apparently points to the growing complexity and heterogeneity of the internal relationships of the complex. But he also like before like equates this with growth in general. So novelty and like new forms are like necessarily tied to growing for him. And I think this is kind of like what makes.
Yeah, but wouldn't you distinguish between progressive selection and positive selection? Right? Because, for example, the increasing growing complexity and heterogeneity, I think that he assigns it to positive selection.
Mostly.
Right? So inside progressive, meaning, right? I mean, my understanding of it is something like if you have if you have some system, right, and it has some stuff going in and out of it. If it's to stay itself, let's say, and it has some form, right? If in T2, like this material is now totally gone through it. So this is a new material. So in some sense, it is a new system, but the form is still the same, right? That's the conservative. So the form is just the same. If you have a system that has some form and it has some interaction with the environment, but it also, the form of the environment, let's say, is relevant, right? In such a way that in the second moment, like the same system now, because of that interaction with the environment, right? Now it has a different form and different stuff going through it. This would be progressive because the form itself needs to change. So this is not a passive term, right? This is an active term as well.
Yeah, that seems to be the main thing is form changing overall is the commonality, and then you have these kind of localized formal persistencies.
Yeah, and then you can call it like a negative progressive, right? I mean, so this would be conservative because F1 is preserved, right? This would be progressive, but then you can have the negative one where this was more complex than this, or you can have positive where you actually had an increase in richness, right? But I think both of them are considered progressive. So progressive has to do with if the form of the first organization and the second moment, they're the same or not. If they're different, it's progressive. And then it's negative or positive, depending on if it went up on complexity and diversity or down, right? Something like that.
But don't you agree that, I mean, he does, I still feel it lacks, like he doesn't have the concept of like a stable orbit, because a stable orbit is something that is conservative and progressive at the same time.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
It's something that's robust to perturbations, and perturbation would be exactly like you can explore like the space of potential like interferences of the system, and it's able to kind of like react in different ways while still preserving conservatively the form. So for him, the only way to do this is by either like being positive or negative. So either you end up like disintegrating, or you end up like growing and dominating.
Yeah, you're right. Like he would need a theory of, let's say, a class of equivalent forms, right? Where you can talk about some perturbation that even though you change like from F2, F3 or F4, for all purposes, they all kind of are defined by the same attractor, for example. So it's changed, but it's conservative, right?
Yeah. And I think that that concept didn't exist until, I know, wait, Lyapunov, which is like the Russian, he's from 18.
I think he was alive. Yeah, he was about to die, in fact.
Yeah. Like dynamical systems was being developed more or
Yeah.
less at that time, so it makes sense that he wasn't familiar, I think.
Yeah. But I mean, let's see what he does in the next chapter, because in the next chapter, apparently he brings the...
Yeah, it's true. Stability of...
Yeah, but I agree with you that there is it's hard to shake the feeling that that there is a kind of perhaps an ideological connection for him between progressive selection and some level of incrementation of the form, right? That he didn't have to make that connection. Like, I do think that he's smart enough to say, negative. I think he's not moral about negative selection, right? What he calls like simplification or of internal structure and increase of homogeneity, right? Diminution of the number of connections, increasing homogeneity. I don't think he's treating simplification in structure as, let's say, impoverishment in a moral sense, and positive growing of complexity as a positive, morally like necessary thing, which I think would be bad. I think it's not very useful, especially because, I mean, the guy being a Marxist, to put economic growth on the side of progressive selection already means it's a very kind of ambivalent process, right? There's nothing necessarily good about it.
Yeah, speaking of that, it really echoes or resonates with the Marxist notion of the technical composition, right? That we've been.
Yeah. No, this
talking
chapter,
about.
I mean, this chapter has a lot of stuff that is kind of giving a sort of, I don't know, philosophical or kind of more, organizational backbone, right? To the theory of labor and rethinking labor in terms of conjunction and disjunction, which, I mean, I'm happy that I managed to not mention conjunctions and envelopes for 2 hours and a half. But, there is a sort of compositional theory of labor in the beginning of this chapter. There is a sort of more complex theory of what it means to combine complexes to increase, like how to preserve a form, you need to increase it. Like, it really connects with the technical and organic composition. I mean, it is a dialogue, right, with that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just because of Marx's exposition talks about like capital with constant technical composition, right?
It's interesting to imagine if constant capital would be a conservative preservation, right? You change, like, from the standpoint of value, not of the material body. Constant capital is like conservative preservation, right? It changes form absolutely, right? You buy, like, again, the example I gave a couple of times ago, like you buy $100 worth of paper and you turn it into origami. It changed, but it conserves the value, right? Whereas labor or variable capital is more like progressive selection. Not only does it change form, but it changes the quantity of value that is connected to that form because of the way it's interacting with other systems, in the case, the paper, right?
Yeah, I mean, that one is a bit complicated because if you turned it into origami with labor, then you did add value, right?
Yeah, that's my point.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant turning it into origami like with a machine.
No, like constant capital would be conservative, right? In the sense that the matter changes, but the form of value, right, is preserved. Just a second. Whereas a variable capital, not only does labor change form, right, in the sense that effort goes into the paper and there is like a conjunction between these things that changes the laborer, changes the paper, but the value in that process actually increases. So it's not simply the conservation, right? There is something progresses so that it conserves. I don't know. Yeah, now I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think I was thinking less on the level of labor and constant capital, but more on the level of the total, like a capital reproducing itself, and whether or not it has some kind of stability with regard to the composition, organic composition, or if it's a dynamic organic composition. But we can talk about it later. I think it's too hazy right now.
Yeah,
to make that connection.
Anyway, I think that this last point is important, right? That he said after presenting the formulating mechanism, right? Conjunction, ingression, disingression, crisis, and presenting the regulating mechanism, which is a sort of dynamic approach to this, right? Conservative and progressive, and then positive and negative. He says that these things are not separate. With sufficient analysis, any process of positive or negative selection decomposes into innumerable elementary changes, conjunctions with ingressions and disingressions arising from them. These are two different viewpoints in tektological investigation. I would say that the formulating mechanism is the atomic logic, and the regulating mechanism is the theory of change. Or something crazy like that.
Yeah, maybe because in between the atomic logic and the theory of change is also just relations, right? Those external relations.
Yeah.
That preserve the composition.
Yeah, you're right. Perhaps regulate. I mean, I think it's too dynamic to not include some idea of change, right? But I agree with you. Like, perhaps conservative preservation looks like relation, right?
Yeah, and then, but the thing which produces a new regulating mechanism is change, right?
Yeah.
Badiou's strong theory of change.
Yeah, we like stronger points.
Stronger change. Yeah.
I have a question, like, is this his idea of, I mean, I've never seen this before, this idea of crisis as creation or destruction of a boundary. Is that like something?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know where he took this from. It's not the Marx theory of crisis, right? I'm not even sure if he mentions it here, like where he took it from.
I thought it was very interesting. I'm not even sure if I understand.
Yeah, in a sense, it just looked to me like a bit of a vague idea, because where is it? Yeah, crisis. There is a okay. It doesn't, the footnote doesn't say anything. Yeah, the footnote on boundaries is just an explanation. I don't remember any mentions to this in the stuff that I've seen, like with a reference, but yeah, the way I understood the crisis is just that, where is it?
It's a little bit down. Crisis
Yeah, here,
yeah.
Breaching the tektological boundary. Yeah, it seems like it's a temporal version, right? Like conjunction, temporally speaking, becomes like critical points and things like this, right? So I don't know, I would say that the theory of like action and resistance, once you combine action and resistance with the idea of conjunction and disjunction and give it a temporal kind of feel, that's already the theory of crisis for him, right? Which is, I mean, he gives examples. I mean, you can see that his theory of crisis is very kind of cold, right? Like breaking the surface tension of a droplet of water is a critical moment. It's not like profound change in any specific sense, right? So upheavals, revolutions, catastrophes, and breaking surface tension in the water, or making two droplets of water kind of become one. They're all critical moments, right?
Mm-hmm. But I think it's interesting, like the idea of a revolution of all is also being not like just a disorganizing force, but it's also like a way of creating a new boundary between various classes. I mean, it's a breach in the sense of the existing boundaries, but it could also be like a creation of a new boundary, which creates like a new.
Yeah, this is because you asked where else. I think he took it from Deleuze. He was reading Deleuze here.
and René Thon. I think René Thon has a similar idea, right? With catastrophe and bifurcation. Isn't bifurcation like, you know, either you get a kind of like a conjunction or a disjunction from small perturbations?
René who?
René Thon, the guy who wrote that Morphogenesis Structural Stability book. He was a student of, I think he was a friend with Grothendieck. And then when he saw what Grothendieck was doing, he says, fuck it. I'm not gonna compete on the same field. I'm gonna do something else. And then he founded like more basic morphogenetic theory, because it was easier. So, but he uses the way that he uses the idea of catastrophe is very similar, I think. And Robert Rosen, in that Life Itself book, the essays on life itself, not on the life itself, but essays on life itself, he talks about generic perturbation and stability, and mentioning René Thon, and that's where it clarified for me. It does. I would kind of bring the two things together, you know, like I think I have the book here. Fuck, it's 20 gigabytes. Yeah, you can download it here. Where? It's very interesting though that you know, like in terms of like a intellectual history or something like that, that it's well documented that there is this relation between systems theory and Marxism, going from the like a biology research group in, you know, that Joseph Needham was part of in England, in Britain, all the way to the 70s with Varela and Maturana, autopoiesis and so on, right? It's interesting that this was kind of very tightly connected with Marxist concerns with what, like, creating a naturalist Hegel or something like this. But it's interesting because that doesn't seem to be like Engels has that idea, right? In Lewontin, in that dialectical biologist book, starts with quoting Engels, saying, like, we dedicate this book on dialectical biology to Engels because he got most of it wrong, but he got it right where it matters. And this idea of that kind of dialectics of nature and so on. And I find it interesting that the guy who the Marxists who seem the earliest to be on the path towards something that concerns morphogenesis, systems theory, complex theory, wasn't really kind of with that problem in mind, like, oh my God, I have Marx and Hegel on the one hand, but I need to make it compatible with science and naturalism. How do I make Hegel fit into nature? And it seems like a different starting point.
Wait, I lost it. Who are you talking about now?
No, in this sense, Bogdanov, right? It doesn't seem like
Okay. Mm-hmm.
like Engels was, and other Bukharin was a bit like this as well, trying to kind of compatibilize Hegel and naturalism. He seems to have us like. It seems like Ernst, like Mach, is a different starting point in a way, right? He's more fond of kind of the empiricists or something like this. It's a weird kind of path. I think it's also it's more connected to the hard sciences than to philosophy sometimes, right? I mean, he's not like constantly going to show that, this is what some philosopher said about this. Like, he's quoting Einstein and not quoting Hegel.
I do have a very simple and I think pretty naive impression of Bogdanov in the first 3 chapters, which is he does remind me of a lot of Badiou and formalism, but because of his constant reference to resistance and activity, it's like with the physics concept of force. Mm-hmm. But like trying to actually apply it consistently throughout, like what do you do with modern formal logics if you never fully remove yourself from the world as described by physics, right? Because that is what you get with Badiou. You get a world without force, energy, mass, matter. Yeah. And this seems to be like, it makes me wonder if it's similar to the kind of argument you were making earlier about like, you see certain exchange transcendentals really in their own, localized on certain processes like kinship. Mm-hmm. And if maybe like what Bogdanov is trying is by really looking at these forms without ever leaving force, matter, resistance, what really comes out in a way that you don't get when you look at things like Badiou does or other more purely formal approaches.
Yeah, I agree with you. It seems to me like it's, there is this saying today that anthropology is philosophy with people in it. I think that Bogdanov sometimes is like Badiou with energy in it, right? Like if you add a cost function to the structures in logics of worlds, more clearly, like, okay, you can do this, but it costs this much, and this kind of establishes which realm you're talking about, right? The cost is very low, probably a cognitive process. If the cost is very high, it might be a large physical system or something like that. It seems to kind of allow you to connect all these things. I'm really interested in this. I mean, I totally agree with your point, and I think that Dennis and I we met yesterday, and we were talking about how hard it is to properly develop the name for this in-between stance, because it's, on the one hand, you're trying to be more general than Marx. So it's not about production and economy. You want a perspective where, for example, energetic costs more globally, or I don't know, right? Ecological constraints, or what Marx was already doing. He wasn't really worried about it purely economic means, because the problem of poverty, pauperization, those are precisely, let's say, the non-economic costs of economy, right? So he wanted a broader perspective, and then he tried to broaden it a bit more to include something that the word seems to be ecology, right? Like the point of view where like the sort of costs of more things, more entities can be taken into consideration. But you also want to avoid falling into a sort of kind of unified perspective where everything is already accounted for, which I think is what like radical ecological thought with like new materialisms tend to be. Like if I'm taking a broader perspective, then I am required to consider all living entities, all possible approaches, and rather than having a richer frame to talk about specific structures, you get a sort of vague perspective from which you can't really be bothered to construct much stuff because there is no sense of agency. Everything is already doing their thing. It's like, so I think on the one hand, it's hard to move from economy to a sort of ecological point of view, where you do want to consider more stuff without also making this kind of disappear with the specificity of what you're talking about. And on the other hand, there is the, rather than going up, there is a going down process from the sort of idea of worlds in general, right? To what I think is kind of Bogdanov's perspective, where the organizational point of view for him is not about, I mean, it is more general than the planet, right? I mean, he does give, it's not like an ecological point of view in that sense of everything is connected through the system Earth, right? That's not his starting point, right? But it is a slightly different starting point than the sort of absolutely unconstrained idea of worlds. There is a constraint, right? Added constraint that brings you slightly closer to something else, which I agree has something to do with entropy, something to do with costs and energy and physics, right? You don't want to talk about worlds that are unconstrained by diffusion of forms, right? It's only the sort of.
I was going to say.
It really seemed like.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, and time, right? Time is an important constraint you don't find in Badu.
Yeah.
That you do find in this one.
Yeah.
And he doesn't really seem concerned with the logician question of all possible worlds. He seems,
no, yeah, that's not.
He seems concerned with all actual things, but he also, with his listing method that you pointed out, he does seem to have this criterion of like, if you can list it, I have to account for it.
Yeah,
but,
it's true.
But
yeah.
not if you can imagine it, I have to account for it. Like, I'm not playing that game. That's too far. That's more like what something like Badu's would have to account for. But this is like, if you can point to me in somewhere existing a thing, Tektology has to give you an organizational point of view on it. And that's kind of the his approach to universality.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, I mean, these ideas are all connected, right? Energy, entropy, time, I mean, they are closely connected in one way. So it does seem like, I mean, for example, nothing prevents Bogdanov from talking about, you know, cosmic exploration. It is a universal approach, but the universe is precisely kind of, I would say this, right? It's universal in the sense that the universe is a constraint on energy, right? It's not universal in the sense that it's independently, that it is underdetermined, right? It's not that notion of universality. But it is very, very interesting the way that he defines, right, the objects for this thing, that you can create this weird list. He seems to be very aware that, I mean, because of what he says in the first chapter, that, you know, metaphors allow you to transfer organizational methods from different areas, and that this has a limit and so on. So he knows that you won't be able to move from, you know, a cube of sugar in a box to interstellar interaction between astral bodies. There is nothing in common in a way, right? Or there are very little in common, but so he seems aware of that, but then again, he wants to create this really weird list that really oblige you to kind of only look at some formal level, right? So it is a weird kind of mixture of being grounded on like the world as it is, but also stretching you to kind of, okay, like these things have nothing to do, but the fact that two things became one, you know, like it is weird.
Yeah, I think actually one way we can think of it is Bogdanov occupies the space within Badiou's theory of change, right? In Badiou's vision, it's like there are worlds and there are logics in each world. They're all particular, and that's very similar to saying everything is organized in a certain way.
Yeah.
But Badiou's theory of change is very focused on one specific kind of change. He kind of breezes through the weaker forms of change so that he can go directly to the important, like, kind of change that he cares about. But it's like Bogdanov is spending more time, taking more time to elaborate how it is that different forms are constantly changing. Kind of the weak notion of change that we talked about.
I think that follows, like, from what you're saying, it follows another thing I was thinking about it, which is I have the impression that ultimately, I mean, what do you think? Isn't it the case that if you only have weak change, meaning all transformations in value ultimately are within the same transcendental, that you only have one world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, every world, I mean, I think that's what makes Bogdanov also very strong. Like, the organizational point of view seems a way of saying, if you give me a world, I can come up with another world of which that world is a phenomenon, not a world, right? Like, you think this is the outer boundary, this system, but this system has an environment, which means there is another world, which has that world inside of it as an object, for example, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, there's no environmentless world.
Yeah, no, there's no environmentless world, and it seems to me like that those two things go together. Like, he does seem to have a sort of methodological theory of worlds where he does accept that, you know, atoms are logically determined by their organization, their systemic structure. So the parts are contextual. He does accept ideas of scale. It does give you a sort of theory of perspectives on these things, but he also keeps open the constant possibility given by physics and a sort of energetic point of view that you can always take that boundary and kind of contextualize it on a larger system of which it is a part, right? So there is no situation where you would need strong, I mean, it's almost like a trade-off, right? You lose the idea of strong change to gain a sort of more kind of relative theory of worlds, right? You never need to account for, let's say, the total transformation of a form into another in terms of radical change, because you can take a point of view that is outside of that difference, where that big difference now looks like a smaller transformation in a larger system, right?
Wouldn't it also be the case, like from an organizational point of view, that when you get to that high level in Badiou, because it's not just that he has this high level for truth, but he's got a heterogeneous, he's got the conditions. There really isn't the same kind of grounds for that heterogeneous differentiation in Bogdanov, right? Like,
no, I don't think so.
Art,
yeah,
science, all these things are organizational forms, and the distinctions would be far secondary for him compared to what they have in common as organizations.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because he ends up mobilizing the exact same things. And in a certain sense, I think, but you agrees with him, right? That, I mean, mathematics does allow you to say something about that small common part between art and other things. But this is a point that I'm really interested in this, I feel like Marxism has a very hard time with the idea that, it's no wonder it's a big topic in Marxism, like the autonomy of art. Trotsky, discussing with Breton if art is political or not, and things like this. Is science, is there a proletarian science, right? It's a Lysenko topic. Is there a proletarian art? It's a Brechtian topic. Is there a political form of law? You know, the Krupskaya and Kollontai, everyone discussing this. Because it's hard to imagine that there is something that is novel and true and important that is kind of indifferent to politics, right? So I think that, I mean, the generic in Marx is a unified idea, right? Everything is an expression of a same capacity. And I feel like this is something that really makes Badiou a weird figure in Marxism, which is the idea that, I mean, politics is everything, but it's not all, right? Everything fits into politics, but it doesn't mean it's the best way to do stuff for all stuff. I don't see anyone having that position in Marxism. And I think Bogdanov really fits this more classic Marxist approach where if you just substitute genericity as a property of labor for genericity as a sort of capacity for organizations under certain conditions, right? To establish new forms that are irreversible or now kind of capable of sustaining increased perturbations and so on. You have a more, I'm not even seeing if the kind of progressive or continuous theory of novelty is what is defining about that. I think it might be able to account for very sudden changes, but it is kind of committed to the idea that there is always a unified perspective, it seems to me, that can redescribe very heterogeneous things from the perspective of a common environment. Right, and I think Badiou abdicates from that part. Like, there is not one world for all worlds, right? Even if there is the world of, let's say, the theory of what a lot of worlds have in common, that's still not the theory of all worlds, right?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting place for the interaction between Badiou and Bogdanov, because on the one hand, that kind of space that you're talking about that Badiou carves out to think these things in their difference and in their not all is really important and a big part of why his system works so well, I think. But on the other hand, one of the things I find, you know, one of those little things that we find frustrating reading him, when he makes distinctions like science versus technology, politics versus management, and these kind of things. When if you actually look at the history of the Bolsheviks, for example, management was a major issue. Technology was a major issue. And I feel like what Bogdanov's system really does is it enables you to move between those levels without, and like seeing the interconnections between them and what it would actually entail in a, you know, when we ask questions about planning and
Yeah.
that kind of stuff, to move from the heterogeneity of these fields into, like, you know, because what ends up being an issue politically for all of them is they all intersect in these kind of what Badiou makes to be lower kind of levels a lot of times. And I think for what's exciting about Bogdanov in a lot of ways is he sees those lower levels having just as much interesting kind of information and structure and form as the higher levels. And that's part of what I find really cool about is like popular tektology is looking and finding like these deep organizational thoughts in quote common forms. And I think you can make something similar when you look at like technicians. It's part of also the reason I was bringing up technicians is I feel like Bogdanov's work really helps make sense of why of those kind of intelligences that really don't get a lot of space in Badiou's system because he's looking at art, science and stuff. When you're looking at the problem solving of a tech or the care logic of a nurse or a teacher and stuff, I feel like there's a lot more space in Bogdanov for us to really think about that without necessarily losing what we gain from Badiou.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I mean, I think that one thing happened with the stuff that Dennis and I have been working is that I feel like most of the stuff I thought that was missing in Badiou is compatible. It's just not like having to write a 700-page long book. I think he chose to focus on like very low granularity kind of statements. But there's a lot of ways it can make statements that are compatible with that are, you know, more in that direction. But I mean, more than besides the question of degree, you know, like how detailed or how distinctive you can get with, for example, discerning logics of change for those objects whose composition is this or that, and then you get a sort of, you could get perhaps to a distinction between engineering and, you know, technological innovation, scientific. I mean, perhaps you could be more kind of subtle with those distinctions. I still think you're right in the sense that, but I think Badiou has such a commitment to underdetermination, you know, like to be so vague and broad that there is no chance you're going to come up with something which, like some novel way of doing something that is kind of interdicted or not legitimized by his approach. That, I mean, most kind of situated, more engaged takes on things, you know, automatically seem so much more rich, you know, like Bogdanov with this sort of communist Soviet, let's transform everything, let's look at everything as, you know, being amenable to some sort of similar treatment. And it's clearly, you know, it's clearly inspired on the, like, the tasks of the proletariat. Let's take those tasks and look at everything from its perspective, right? And though I think it's quite compatible, I mean, I think Badiou would be the first to say that, well, the more kind of situated you are, the richer the perspective. It's still totally different, right? Once you do find something like that. I think the same thing with Marx, right? The guy didn't write a good book on the logic of value because he was a scholar. He did it because he was very politically minded, and he was, let's say, passionately looking at the thing, right? So yeah, anyway, I agree. It's more than just a gradual distinction.
Yeah, I think it's really important we understand this when we move to after the primer, like the next thing on organization. And
yeah.
Like,
you know, I was wondering, like, yeah. Sorry, Dennis, like, if we shouldn't do a meeting on, let's say, what are we interested in calling the scope of, you know, organization? Like, because from what we just read about Bogdanov, it seems like he wants an even broader use of the term than we are interested in, right? I mean,
yeah, because now we've described this thing called capital. It's a form of organization. We've partially described it, right, based on what Marx did in Capital Volume 1. Now we claim that we can embed this construction, this organism called capital, we can embed it now in some environment. But which environment do we choose for capital? Because depending on which environment we choose and how we describe that environment, certain things become visible, and other things might become hidden, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think that would be a nice kind of exercise for, like, more informal meeting, you know, like after John presents, perhaps we could, you know, kind of use all of this, like what John did, what Caron did a couple of weeks ago, what we did, and kind of try to formulate a kind of provisory take on that. Like, for example, just to give an example, right? To embed capital or nation-state capital into something larger can mean, right? Take the ecological approach where for everything in this system, you're now indexing, for example, you're explicitating the hidden variable of its energetic cost, right? How it's embedded on the planet Earth as a system, or even in the solar system, insofar as, you know, solar energy is concerned. That's an embedding. It has a direct consequence, like it does change the presentation of everything that was composed inside that previous system, right? But I feel like you want to manage both sides at once. You want to enrich without being, you want to enrich this space without giving it so much richness that you can't tell apart two experiments, for example, that are possible, right? I mean, from that perspective, to organize, to participate in the organization of the, strike of the Uber drivers and to do something else, it's practically discernible, right? Like you want to keep it to some level where it's not only that you get more information, you get more relevant information. I think that might be the distinction. And I think that helps to discern, like, okay, but at what level you want to kind of make this new cut, right? Like, is the level,
like it's not as useful if we talk about the solar system if what we're trying to do is inform like strikes, and
yeah,
we're trying to understand that kind of logic. Like it doesn't matter how capitalism uses solar energy or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say, like, it's not that it doesn't matter, right? But you get enough information from a much more restricted point of view than having to go all that way.
Right.
And I mean, I feel, for example, the thing I was mentioning with like Donna Haraway and some of the ways that you can enrich this embedded environment that can kind of be right at the brink there is, for example, you say, well, a richer environment would not make the distinction between types of organization to the, or let's say what we could call like natural and social organizations. Those are all kind of human and non-human. They're all mixed. So rivers, people organizing, so trade unions and rivers are just types of the same thing, right? That can be useful, but it also seems right already at the fringe where you enrich so much that, okay, like, seems like it's a bit too much. It's like it's close to Bogdanov, for a general tektology, but like for a political tektology, it seems perhaps a bit like it lacks some constraint, So there might be a way to address this and to discuss this a bit that could be useful. It could also we could come up with a more precise idea of where are we drawing the line between political organization and systems in general, right? Organized systems, naturally conditioned organized systems, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good line to go with.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I feel it can be related to like, so one operation is this one of regionalizing in the sense of placing like capitalistic forms in a broader space of social forms, of non-capitalistic forms. But I think another like vector that is important, and I think Bogdanov helps a lot, is situating from the point of view of social struggle. So like the way how you like re-embed this kind of like broader space into like a local struggle. So being able to assess that like, so not only like in general how this form relates to capital, but also how does this relates to a concrete social struggle.
Yeah,
I think Bogdanov gives you the tool in the sense that you have like this natural vision in which you're like, you have a certain perspective that you have to assume in order to evaluate what's constructive and what's destructive. So it's a way of measuring like the distance between advancing and not advancing in political, like it's a strategic view in the end, which I think helps.
Yeah, I agree with you. I totally agree with you. And I think that can be also translated in the sense that you can embed the system in a larger space, But then the question is also like, what else in the previous system is visible from that larger embedding, right? So I think social struggle has a lot to do with that, right? Can you make better descriptions of, let's say, strategic movements from that richer environment, right? As we were saying, like the solar perspective is not going to give you better names for talking about strategy, right? For most political activity. So that's kind of like a more internal metric, right? Like a strategic metric for what is an interesting embedding and what is not.
It's also a really interesting place to kind of go back and try to further specify this conservative versus progressive selection in a lot of ways, because that really kind of gets into what exactly, you know, in strategies, in tactics, like what exactly is testing, is kind of like opening up to just probabilities versus like when we know we're actually replicating something more or less. Which kind of actually makes me think of that distinction you make in your paper, Gabriel, between like the kind of like purely reproductive things you had to do a CSII, is simply kind of participating, versus when you actually have the space to test whether or not a form could kind of like interact on its own as a form without some kind of like justification or reason or what have you. There's something interesting going on in that split between those two things, I think.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I have some ideas on this discussion, but I think maybe we wait until the next.
Yeah, we should definitely schedule this and try to work around. I mean, I think that this would be really important for the stuff we wanted to do, because I feel like there's an easy tendency to do something that I don't think is that useful, which is, let's say, you can talk about generalizing or embedding and so on from the global local or the local global version, right? Both of them can account for a broader space. And I think Badiou is smart in that in Logics of Roles, it gives you the tools to locally construct something that is globally richer than the transcendental. But he doesn't tell you like, well, if you look at this, suddenly you see everything in a, you know, with more clarity or something like this. You need to kind of, I think he commits to the idea that organization, like concrete organizations that are kind of stitched together, they might not cover everything in a new, like with a larger space, but they kind of get to sense information that is pertains to that larger space, right? So rather than simply move from, let's say, nation state capital to this environment and try to describe it generally, which would actually be methodologically kind of insane, you don't need to do that, right? You just need to construct, like, you need to start finding means to talk about what would it mean to locally organize inside this restricted space in such a way that the information that you are acquiring through this organization does not pertain to it, but to something bigger. Like, that's different, right? Like, it's like being embedded in a two-dimensional surface, right? But knowing that if you can make some paths in the surface, you can tell the genus of the surface, right? It's not like you embedded it in 3 dimensions. You're still in 2 dimensions. You're still inside the local Euclidean space. But if like 2 Jordan curves, two closed circles in that space only touch at one point, you know it's not a sphere, not a plane. But you never really removed yourself to see it all at once, right? Not sure if my example made any sense.
It's a crazy example.
It's the best example, okay? I mean, it's definitely the best example. Like, I feel very nerdy, but right? Say you don't know what this is, right? You're a flatlander, right? We know that you can tell. Let's say you make a path here, like a closed loop, right? An inside and an outside. If you make a second path and it crosses twice, right? That's the normal case. right? But let's say you don't know which space you're in, and you make like a path like this, and it goes back here. You already know something, right? You know that you're not in a. You learn something about a total space without having to embed it in 3 dimensions. Because, for example, if this is the case, you know that you're not in a flat like this. You're probably at least on a sphere, right? You did this, right? But now imagine that you move this way. If you're in a sphere, once you get here, you're going to cross here again, right? Which is equivalent to actually touching here. And well, since this point is identified with this point and this with this, you touch twice. Once at this, you cross once here and once at the borders, which are identified. So it's like crossing here and crossing here again. You did one run like this and one like this, right? Say that you did the same thing, right? You start walking, but you only cross the border once. So you drew something like this, and then you start walking in this direction, but you only cross with the frontier here once. Well, you need to be in a torus, right? If this is a torus, you can actually cross it like this. And if you do another circle like this, they will only cross here. So you can tell the genus of the surface by the Jordan curves you can make on it. But you don't need to be able to embed, right, the bidimensional space on 3 dimensions, like this, or like this, with 3 dimensions, to be able to tell which one is which. Only by locally looking at the Jordan curves you can make inside of it, you can already tell which ones you're not and which ones you're more likely in.
In this case, you do have to go around the whole Donut, no?
In this case here, right?
Like you have to walk a lot.
Yeah, actually, I mean, you need to walk a lot, yes. But to be honest, like you need to do, yeah, you need to go once like this, and then once like, yeah, you need to cross, go around this hole here and around the center, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but perhaps you need to do a lot. But still, I like the example because it has the idea that the way that this thing's in chain, right? Mm. What the possible ways of enchaining tell you something about the large structure you are in. But from a local perspective, you don't need to be able to know, like to take a bird's eye point of view or to mobilize an additional dimension to be able to tell something about the topology of the space you're in.
Yeah, I see the point.
Right. I mean, that's a way of talking about embedding and extracting information about something that doesn't require you to make the distinction between, right? It doesn't require you to always arrive at the richer space by moving to a global point of view. We don't need to like write a paper describing the space of all possible free associations. We can just show that if locally you can consistently think some ways of freely associating, you can tell something about this larger space you're in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. It is very psychoanalytic because it's also based on local impossibility, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There are always local impossibilities that attest to some global structure.
Yeah, I think Emil Post is the guy who did really cool work on this, right? On connecting formal consistency with impossible statements in a formal system. Like why it is that if you can identify the sort of impossible statement of a given system, it tells you something about the type of consistency that system has. I don't remember now which paper he does that. I know Luca Fraser writes on it as well.
Who's that? Emil Post?
Yeah.
Okay.
There is a good there's a good introduction to his work in the preface to Concept of Model.
Oh, okay.
By Luca Fraser. She goes into it. I mean, Badiou uses him in the Infinitesimal Subversion, like a very old text as well.
Oh, so that wasn't Badiou's concept of a model. That's a different.
No, in Badiou's concept of the model, the introduction to the text by someone else mentions Post and uses him.
Okay. So you were talking about that. Okay.
Yeah, and in Badiou's other text called Infinitesimal Subversion, he says like, yeah, the Lacanian thing about impossibility, the real as possible. There is this, you know, this theorem in mathematical logic which pretty much captures that with none of the bullshit. So I don't know. It's just saying that there is a nice kind of feel to this, you know. But I agree, it's a bit too much for after 3 hours of Bogdanov. It might be a bit. My brain is melting.
The last part, if I'm able to get through it all, which I think I will, the last part of it was on the semantics and kind of issues of organization. So, well, we can use it as a way to lead into the following meeting if that's what we want to do.
That would be amazing.
And bring it up again. And we can bring it up again in the context of what I talk about and kind of have this conversation also in our minds and stuff. So, but yeah, no, I had the same kind of question about generalization and like what happens when you use organization as broadly as Bogdanov does. What exactly is left of what we, you know, generally use the word organization for. So I think that's a really good thing to talk about and kind of often a thing that comes up when you try to systematize things is the key terms get so abstract and kind of multivariate. It's hard to see how you use them consistently.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I don't think we'll need much more work to be able to like kind of sediment a bit of a different language to talk about things, you know, because it has you know, like this stuff that we're working through, like it integrates, it seems like it's very natural to integrate like a logistical point of view, a slightly different way of talking about strategy that also includes epistemology somehow, right? I mean, for example, it seems very natural to say from the perspective we're talking about that between two possible actions, the best one, like two possible actions that are equal in most regards, that the one whose failure or success, like I would give two criteria, like an action between two actions whose success is equally interesting, it's better to choose the one whose failure is also interesting in the sense that it might teach you something. I mean, and that only makes sense if epistemology in politics is part of strategy, right? And second, like between two actions that, again, make the same sense, the success one that has the added success of increasing your kind of visibility of a space is also, I mean, preferable to, right? That I think those are like specific statements that this sort of approach allows you to make. Or for example, an idea that I think is also very connected to it, right? The idea that between two lines of strategy that you can take, the one that can the easiest can be taken up by someone else, the easiest way, you know, it's also preferable, right? So in the sense of kind of like that idea that Apolito has of instruments of connectedness, right? It fits there. Like, I don't know, I think it's not hard to see this kind of boil down to quite practical sensibility, you know, at some point in the near future, I'd say.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's, I mean,
hopefully
what's exciting is that's what's exciting about it is it does have what's the term they use? Mobilize it to do things. It's not quite the term.
Yeah, the degree of bullshit per statement is low, I'd say.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's up to discussion, of course. But
Well, I can think of plenty of Marxists that will say our bullshit is actually quite high, but I'm not too sure.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we should establish some standard of, you know, regular bullshit per statement, like what would be an acceptable level, and then we can measure it, you know.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that could be a meeting all on its own.
It's our new signal noise. It's bullshit the statement.
Yes, bullshit to
ratio.
statement.
And
Yeah, I mean, I can think of some people we could use as the, you know, the extreme cases to measure. Yeah. Okay, guys, I need to run to eat something.
All right. Good meeting.
all right,
Okay, guys.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. See you next week.
Bye.